Now, let's look at another very, very common objection that we have to deal with all the time. And that, in essence, is illustrated by a situation that I encountered many years ago, sitting in the chapel at Grand Canyon College at the time. This was in the mid-1980s. We had just started going out to Mesa to share the gospel with Mormon folks. And there was a fellow sitting behind me. And so I was just bubbling over with some meetings I had had with Mormon missionaries. And so I was leaning over the chair, and we were early for chapel, so I wasn't interrupting anything. And I was telling him all about these meetings with Mormon missionaries and how excited I was and how the missionaries had really seemed to be listening and so on and so forth. And he sort of, patiently listened to me, and then I sort of took a breath, and he sort of shrugged his shoulders and said, "What a waste of time." And, it felt like someone had taken a big old thing of Gatorade like they do with the coaches at the end of the game, just, so much for the fire this guy had. And I said, "Waste of time? What are you talking about?" He says, "Well, if they're predestined, they're going to be saved. You're wasting your time talking to them." And I'm like, "What?" And I had heard the word used in describing him. He was a Calvinist. And he was a dour-faced, unhappy, never smiling, never excited, sing even the happiest tune as a death dirge type guy. And so that was my first definition, my first understanding of what a Calvinist was. And all I knew was I didn't want to be one of them because this guy didn't talk to missionaries, and this guy was just boring. I didn't want to be him. And obviously, we recognize that he was not actually a Calvinist. In fact, I'm sad to have to say that in the years that followed after that, he not only left the faith, but my understanding is that he is a practicing homosexual today. But in those days, he claimed to be as Calvinistic as the day was long, and he was what we would properly identify as a hyper-Calvinist. That is, an individual who did not believe that there is any responsibility placed upon us as believers to share the gospel with those around us and to freely proclaim the gospel as if somehow we had the ability to slip on a pair of super sunglasses that made the elect glow green so that we only share the gospel with those who are going to respond to it. While that would be a very nice thing to have, it doesn't work that way. But it is very, very common for those who oppose Reformed theology to paint us as if we are the chosen frozen. And certainly there are denominations, especially those denominations that tend to become somewhat genetically oriented. What I mean by that is there are some Reformed denominations where you pretty much know everybody, when you walk through the door, is going to have a Dutch last name, for example. And you get into some places up north, Canada, places like that, and sadly, the description that the broad brush painted description of Calvinists can sometimes be very much fulfilled. I have encountered situations where I was speaking in a church that was quote unquote Reformed, but you couldn't get somebody excited about going out to share the gospel with somebody if your life depended on it. I mean, it's just, look, my grandfather was this, my great-grandfather was this, I won't marry anybody who doesn't have isn't in this church, and that, it's just this, and the term chosen frozen seems to work real well in that situation. We know that's not the way things are supposed to be. And I think one of the reasons, for example, that I got to speak over at the third annual convocation of the IRBS a couple of weeks ago was because I'm sort of a walking, talking refutation of the idea that Reformed Baptists think you can just sit back and leave the evangelism to somebody else. And because we go up to Salt Lake City, we go out to Mesa, we do the sort of in-your-face type stuff that we do with debates and things like that. And so how do you respond, however, to those who would say, well, to embrace the theology that you are promoting is to embrace the death of evangelism? Well, a couple thoughts in the few minutes that we have before the end of the class today. First thing, I think, is to properly define evangelism. There is a very narrow and improper definition of evangelism that is very, very common in our land today. We have all been exposed to it, so by default we need to recognize when we have been exposed to it and where it is an error. Generally, evangelism, as it is utilized by most people today, means a Christian sharing a salvation message with an unbeliever. And interestingly enough, I've found that for many of those folks, it almost needs to be an unbeliever in anything. In other words, I've actually encountered people. I remember I was very discouraged when I first started doing Mormon evangelism with people saying, look, they already have a belief, leave them alone, there's enough unbelievers out there to deal with. So in other words, for some people, the definition of evangelism is so narrow that it's presenting a four spiritual laws type message to a pagan who has no religious belief whatsoever. Well, personally, I don't think there's any such thing as a person who has no religious belief whatsoever in the first place. But beyond that, any type of apologetic encounter is automatically dismissed by some people as having any type of evangelistic element to it, which I reject as well. Look back at Romans chapter 1 for a moment. I won't get into Romans chapter 1 and the suppression of God's truth, all the rest of that stuff. I just want you to notice a use of a term in Romans 1:15. Romans 1:15. So for my part, I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. I am eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. Now, actually, that is the verbal form of euaggelizō, to preach the gospel, to proclaim the gospel, to evangelize. That would be the closest term. Now, if you stop and think for a moment, read it in its context, he's addressing the church at Rome. And he says, I want to come and evangelize you. So here is a use of the very term from which we get evangelism, the active verb to evangelize, and it's being used by Paul of Christians. So we need to recognize, I think the first problem we need to try to refute or get rid of in a conversation when someone says that Reformed theology results in the death of evangelism is to say, well, if you have an unbiblical view of evangelism, if you have what is in reality a only partially biblical view of evangelism, then I'm not sure I'm going to argue with you. Because if all you're saying is evangelism as that narrow little thing, yeah, Reformed theology is against that because Reformed theology recognizes that evangelism is a wider thing. When you proclaim the gospel, when you proclaim all of the gospel, not just a portion of the gospel, but everything God has revealed about what he's done in Jesus Christ, when you proclaim that in any context, that is, when you proclaim it to the unbeliever without a religious belief, when you proclaim it to the religious person who has a false religious belief, when you proclaim it to the Muslim, when you proclaim it to the Buddhist or the Mormon, and when you proclaim it from the pulpit of the church to believers in the context of the worship of the church, every single one of those contexts involves what is truly biblical evangelism. All of those things involve the proclamation of the gospel, and believers need to be evangelized. Why? Because not a one of us has a full and complete understanding of everything there is to know. Any person who has known the Lord for any period of time knows that as we read, as we study, we can go over passages of Scripture that we have actually taught on before, and all of a sudden discover a connection between this element of God's truth and another element of God's truth we had never seen before. That can happen to every single believer, and if you think it stops after a certain number of years or a number of graduate degrees or something, it doesn't. It better not. So all of those things are evangelism. Believers need to hear the evangel. And I'm not saying that what they need to hear is a warmed over, simplistic, shuffle the points around a little bit, come up with some new poems and some new heart-tugging stories type of surface-level teaching.